as everybody knows, I've invited questions, and I've invited them in writing. I've invited them in writing for two reasons. First of all, so that you can frame your questions more precisely than you might have framed them had you done so verbatim. And secondly, so that if I had all the questions in writing before me, I could sort of sort them out into groups and deal with them in groups, because some of the questions do overlap and are sort of related or interrelated. For instance, I've got a whole group of questions on the positive group, as we may call it. I've got another group on the FWBO, the movement. I've got another group of questions on men and women and the evolutionary process in general. I've got another couple of questions on problems of practical life. A couple of questions about two of my own Kalyana Mitras. A question about communication, question about stream entry, question about meditation, question about desert islands discs. I must say, I rather like the idea of that desert island. In some moods, anyway. I'm not quite sure where to start, but perhaps I'd better sort of play safe and start with the questions on different aspects of the positive group. So that's just a very approximate description. For instance, the first question says, so far, a strong emphasis within the Friends has been towards people leading a full-time spiritual life by involvement in communities and cooperatives. At this stage in the development of the FWBO, would it now be appropriate to clarify and strengthen the role of those individuals who are unable or unwilling to live a full-time spiritual life? And in the same way, another question is, please comment on the family with special reference to children and their religious influence in relation to the Friends, and what is the place of the family in the ideal society? And please say something about the centripetal aspects of communities around the same centre. How a community housing cooperative fits into the pattern of the new society, because this has aspects of both a co-op and community. So quite a sort of interrelationship of questions there. So first of all, the first one I read. So far, a strong emphasis within the Friends has been towards people leading a full-time spiritual life by involvement in communities and cooperatives. At this stage in the development of the FWBO, would it now be appropriate to clarify and strengthen the role of those individuals who are unable or unwilling to live a full-time spiritual life? This obviously raises the question at the very beginning of what does one mean by a full-time spiritual life? The question seems to assume that you can lead a full-time spiritual life by involvement in communities and cooperatives, but there seems to be some doubt in the questioner's mind as to whether you can live or lead a full-time spiritual life if you're not involved in communities and cooperatives. Well, in a sense, of course, you can, because you can live a full-time spiritual life if you're away on solitary retreat. You're not involved then either in a community or a cooperative. But if you were meditating and studying the Dharma, I think few people would disagree that you were living a full-time spiritual life, even though you weren't part of a co-op or part of a community. I think, though, that probably what the questioner has in mind is the position of someone who is living at home with family, job, and so on. Is it possible for such a person to live a full-time spiritual life? Well, again, that raises the question, what does one mean by a full-time spiritual life? Supposing you're living in a community, a spiritual community. All right, you're leading a spiritual life presumably when you meditate. That is, if you meditate successfully. You're presumably leading a spiritual life when you study the Dharma in your spiritual community. But supposing you're cooking, are you leading a spiritual life? Well, perhaps you are, perhaps you're not. If you are cooking mindfully, if you're cooking with awareness, if you're cooking with love for those for whom you are cooking, yes, then that cooking activity can be included in your spiritual life. So I don't think one can think of the full-time spiritual life quite in terms of a life occupied with certain specific activities only. To some extent, at least, it depends upon your attitude towards those activities. So I think one should think rather in terms of making the best use of whatever opportunities you have. Probably no one really leads a full-time spiritual life, even in a co-op. All right? You're leading a spiritual life if you're in a co-op, but are you every minute practicing right livelihood? Supposing, for instance, you're selling beans over the counter. Well, presumably that's right livelihood. But supposing in the course of your communication, in the course of a co-op meeting, you get a bit annoyed and you swear at somebody. Well, are you leading at that moment a spiritual life? Well, presumably you're lapsing from it. So I don't think there's any situation which, if you're in it, absolutely guarantees that you're leading a full-time spiritual life, nor any situation, short of a downright unethical or criminal one, that guarantees that if you're in it, you're not leading a spiritual life. You must make the best use of your opportunities and not think of the spiritual life too much in terms of the particular specific form that it takes. We know very well from our study of Buddhism, unfortunately in the East, there can be a very worldly, pseudo-spiritual, or rather perhaps religious or ecclesiastical life, which has the trappings of spirituality, but not the reality. And in the same way, one can sometimes find, in the East also, someone who is leading an apparently worldly life, but at the same time making full use of spiritual opportunities and making spiritual progress. So perhaps that is as much at the moment as can usefully be said on that particular topic in answer to that particular question.